I think one of the deepest and most profound problems facing the right today is its outlook on economics and its lack of a coherent economic theory or perspective that addresses its broader cultural concerns. Because I think, on one hand, you can see that the right has achieved many victories in the cultural spaces, especially in the contemporary conversation. It feels like the door has been blown wide open on all sorts of topics that were once considered radical or fringe or icky. Conversations around mass migration, ethnic replacement, the degrading quality of life for what was once considered standard in the West, a harder time attaining sort of traditional markers of success in Western life, whether that's a family or a home, all sorts of dynamics in terms of racial tensions and the reasons for that. Maybe a healthy degree of race realism has started to creep into the popular consciousness. All of these topics in a not so distant past were kind of unthinkable as being brought into the public square and openly discussed, and even more unthinkable, to believe that it was even more unthinkable to believe that popular consciousness would sort of be aligning to the right, where if you talk to your average person, the brainwashing has now kind of gone the opposite direction as it was before, where before we had a sort of, pathologically, egalitarian society. Now we almost are in a pathologically conspiratorial and paranoid society in which kind of in-group preference it seems to be reaching all-time highs. And it seems that, again, the right has sort of made these sorts of victories in the cultural space. And I think I spoke about in my last video why some of these, victories might be Pyrrhic ones, just in terms of, how much we've lost in terms of intellectual rigor and everything like that in these cultural victories. But notwithstanding this point, it is fair to say that the right has successfully captured the minds of, let's call it, the general public, that even the mainstream political discourse across Europe and America is taking shape around topics that the far right, of course, would be quite happy to see be front and center. And recently, even including topics around Israel and whether or not that is a true ally or not, which I think, again, in a not so distant past, it would be almost unthinkable to think that in popular political discourse, these topics would be deemed acceptable or, pertinent or, even available to be discussed by the general public, whereas now they are. And I think that in some ways, this was the easy victory. And it sounds so crazy to say this because, for such a long time, it felt so hopeless that any of these topics were going to be, something that the right gained ground in. And maybe now that we've arrived at this destination, it's a bit too hasty to say, well, that was the easy part. But I do feel in some way that this was the easy part, because I think, deep down inside of human nature, there are sort of these innate conservative tendencies. I think on a basic level, people don't particularly like change that affects them in, let's just call it, superficially negative ways. People want their hometown to look like it did when they grew up. People want to have friends and family and romantic partners that have similar life experiences, and they want that network to be as big and as healthy as possible. People want access to what the generations before them had, and or even more access than the generations before them had. They want bigger houses, better lives. They want to live a lifestyle that looks like what they've essentially been indoctrinating into believing was the life of the generations before them, and programmed to actually want these things. So even at both a primal and a sociological level, both the narrative of the country and it being this being this place of one generation making progress further and further than the one before it. In many ways, it's the sort of narrative of the West in general. And then also on a primal level, people want to don't want to see the world in which they're familiar with change in some radical way, and also become a place from which they're alienated. So in a way, the right had a sort of gravity working in its favor, and I think that though that was a hard fought battle, and there were many times it did seem that it was going to be impossible to meaningfully change that conversation and bring this stuff into focus. In other ways, you could argue that it would be an inevitability because these changes that the right is talking about on the culture war side of things were truly occurring and were truly visible. I think when someone asked me what made me become more conservative, what sort of radicalized me in a rightward direction. It wasn't ideas, it wasn't readings, though as I became more right wing, I did do the research and the diligence to understand sort of what the tradition was behind the beliefs that I had been developing. But what truly radicalized me was my own two eyes, and moving to New York as a young adult and working my way up the corporate ladder in the midst of a society that felt just purely dystopian on pretty much every axis. And I won't go into sort of what that dystopia necessarily was and what it looked like, but fair enough to say, or most simply put, it looked like the future that the far right essentially warns about. And with my own two eyes, I found myself feeling completely alienated from the environment that I was living and working in. I was disturbed by the fact that my peers, all around me, did not seem to share the same concerns, and that everyone lived in this sort of silent acceptance that this is just the way the world is, and that they were not only tolerating it, but in some ways cheering it on. And of course, that was so radicalizing and so shocking to me, and honestly so horrifying to me that for the next decade of my working life, I made as much of an effort to save up as much money as I could to get the fuck out of there. So nothing radicalized me other than my own experience. And I think that in many ways, when we talk about these cultural victories, a lot of people attribute it to Elon Musk's purchase of X and just the nature of that. Once the town square was opened, people were able to speak freely. People were able to say how they really felt, and thus the conversation changed. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And I think a lot of people, use that to basically say, look how great of a thing it is that Twitter was bought by Elon Musk and that this change happened. And of course, I agree. But I also think it speaks to what I'm saying, which is the cultural conversation in ways was the easy part. As soon as you opened up the floor and opened up free speech, the culture war conversation, it seemed that gravity pulled it into the direction that the right would want it to be pulled in, which is that there would be a mass awareness and a mass awakening to all of these sort of realities that previously were, deeply censored, were not tolerated, et cetera, et cetera. So I think I beat that point to the ground by now. You get it. I think that the culture war stuff is in many ways the easy part. Now, on one hand, while the culture war, I believe, was sort of assisted by that gravitational pull of reality, the culture was getting more diverse. Mass migration was occurring. The wealth gap was increasing, and that this sort of economy that we live in grew increasingly extractionary. The things that people wanted were harder to get. Of course, consumer goods got cheaper, but homes were harder to afford. And of course, the lies on the television and the lies that the mainstream institutions were propagating became harder and harder to believe as free speech became more and more accessible via the internet and everything like that. So, as people who were living in reality had an easy way to see what was wrong, what was happening, where the direction of society was going. These things kind of exist in front of your eyes. Now, the problem that we have, now that conversation has become mainstream, is that you see that this awakening has resulted in actual popular mobilization, politically, and you are seeing more right-wing candidates coming into power, in the case of Donald Trump, or threatening to come into power in some parts of continental Europe, that are talking about these talking points that the culture war is focused on, promising fixes to these issues, being ideologically or at least conversationally aligned with the shape of where the right wants to push things. So yes, we're going to do mass deportations. We are going to sort of fix this culture where you're going to be able to be politically incorrect. You're going to be able to say what you feel again. Men are going to act like men again. Women are going to act like women again, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to, chill out on the pride flags everywhere. And they are getting voted into power by saying that they're going along with, these sorts of consensus points now that, society wants to go backwards a little bit. We want to hit the pause on progress. We want to get back to some sort of stability. We need to get back to the fundamentals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what you see time and time again is that these people will come into power. They will say all the right things. And I think in many ways they are, in a way, ideologically aligned with a lot of these changes. I do think that they agree. Many of them are actually coming into power and are ideologically, aligned with these goals, especially, superficially. I think that they want these changes to occur. They do think the country would be better off if these changes were to occur. They would like the sort of texture and the tone of society to change along the lines that this new sort of like mass right-leaning, awakening is sort of diagnosing and sort of prescribing as fixes to the society. But of course, we do not see these changes actually occurring. You don't see, mass deportations occurring. You don't see, for the most part, meaningful reductions in crime or sort of serious like qualities of life. The joke, really returning into the thing. There's not this like return to the heartland, like return to Europa. We're not living in the green fields. We're not living in a happy little village. We can maybe say a little bit more than we could say before, but we're still, very atomized and very alienated from the world around us. And, it seems that all these victories that we can achieve are very superficial. We'll rename government buildings. We'll rename government departments. We'll rename, the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. And we'll be able to put all these sorts of, based spins on our contemporary reality, at least at a superficial level, and our sort of vernacular, and the way that we speak and that we think. But when it comes to the underlying reality, of course, all of these problems and all these cultural issues did not get invented for no reason, and did not become problems because there was an ideological war that was lost necessarily. Now, I know if any theory cell person is listening to this, there's a totally valid rejection to what I'm saying, in the sense of, yes, the society that we're built on is deeply ideological, and all of these sorts of cultural issues and dynamics, of course, are downstream of the ideology upon which we built this society. Of course, that is true. But when it comes to the sort of situation that we're in now, the sort of dynamics that we're talking about and the dynamics that we're concerned about, particularly around demographic replacement, particularly along this sort of texture of life, how the society looks and feels, how our infrastructure is decayed, how our cities are run down, how our industrial sector has collapsed, that you basically have to live in one of these overcrowded and overpopulated urban centers in order to make this sort of money, in order to get ahead, that the rural areas have essentially been neglected. These are more downstream of the economic system that we have built, which of course in some ways is ideological. But, for the sake of this conversation, I don't think you can really think about it as ideological first. The sort of great quote unquote capitalist free market system that we're living in is directly responsible for these issues, and sort of is responsible, first and foremost for the outcomes in which this, the right, writ large, is problematizing. But what you don't see from the right and what you don't see from this mass awakening is a coherent, a coherent or a sophisticated, or even a really that present at all, criticism of the current economic system. On the right, it seems that economics is something that is in many ways defined by a sort of, a counter push against the left. So if the left is, socialist or communist, the right must take the position that free market capitalism is, of course, the right way to go. On its surface, it looks like the best position for the right. Many people on the right come from these sort of libertarian values, and it makes sense. I feel like just as the sort of common sense gravity of social issues pulls people towards a sort of very light or superficial racial identitarianism, just wanting to be around people that look like themselves, I think common sense will bring you to a sort of sense of light, of course, like libertarianism, where the government should just get out of the way. People should be able to transact. The people who make, provide value to society should make as much money as they're able to. That taxation and the government is not a good, means for distributing resources, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So gravity always pulls that conversation, especially on the right, to this sort of laissez-faire, just let the economy work, don't touch it, just let it keep going. And that, in fact, the problem with the economy is probably there is too much regulation, and there needs to be less roadblocks, and that it should essentially be unchained. And you see this across the board. All of the sort of popular intellectuals on the right, or maybe not popular, but all the sort of like, sort of important ones, quote unquote, your Curtis Yarvins, your Nick Lands, people of that nature are essentially of this accelerationist ilk. They're deeply in bed with Silicon Valley and little tech and things like that. And their big idea is basically that capitalism is this sort of saving force. It's the only place where true competition exists, and that we need to allow capitalism to become unchained, and that will bring our society and our standards of living up so high that it'll pull us into this next generation. But I would categorize, this way of thinking very much in the camp of just more of the same. And it's the same thing that you'll see on the left, in the center left with the Ezra Kleins and this abundance theory. It's basically more neoliberalism. I'm sure, people who are studying, Nick Land and Curtis Yarvin will find some way to problematize that perspective. And I'm sure there are more dynamics to those ideas, once you get into them. But for the most part, it's basically like, let's just take the chains off the system and go full hog on free market capitalism, and just like, may the greatest company win, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's, to circle back for a second, it's more of the same, essentially, is that prognosis. And that is not, in my, point of view, a good position for the right to take, at large. And this is a serious problem for the right, because, we don't have a sophisticated critique of the current capitalist system that, as mentioned before, is responsible for all these changes and these cultural changes that we're concerned about. And the truth of the matter is that we have almost no hope of changing or shifting the tides of these cultural problems, of these societal problems, of demographic change, of the sort of degraded quality of life, of the fraying of the social, of our social networks and our overall sort of like lived experience, if we're not able to address the system that created these realities, and a system that is designed and run on incentives that actively create these realities. So I think the easiest example of this to really think about is mass migration, because we see with mass migration, I think everything that we talk about, whether it's identity politics, the overbearing sort of like the over front and centering of LGBT issues, the women's liberation and feminism, become running rampant and declining birth rates, all that stuff, of course, is downstream of the current financial system that we exist in, and are direct products of it in many ways. But I don't think any of them are as simply as explained and sort of used as a sort of fulcrum point as mass migration. Because when you look at mass migration, it is the most acute point at which it becomes clear that we have a sort of unsolvable problem. Because if our entire financial system is designed around the need for a consistent form of GDP growth and economic growth, with declining birth rates, with any variety of different dynamics, with our shrinking industrial, et cetera. In order to maintain that GDP growth, you do have to import labor. And whether that's unskilled labor or skilled labor, it doesn't matter. At some point, you'll have to import labor in order to do this. And what that means is that if you are on the right and you say, I don't like how my town is changing, I don't like how my lived experience doesn't feel like the one that my parents had, I don't like how my rural community is on decline. I don't like how my city feels less safe than it was before. I don't like how our infrastructure is decaying. All these things. I would like us to stop importing people. And the politicians will come along and they'll say, yes, we're going to stop importing people. But then they get into power and they I'm not going to say they try to do it because they don't, they know it's not possible. But, they have to make some gesture that they're going to do this. But if they do that, they will crash the economy. The economy will suffer greatly. You will see, extreme consequences economically to ending mass migration, ending, skilled immigration, basically hitting the pause button on our infinite growth plan, maybe even going backwards on our infinite growth plan, and as a society essentially shrinking again. And the truth is, our entire economic system is not able to function in a shrinking economy. And that will come with great pain. And I don't say this to dissuade people from pushing back against immigration. I think immigration should be curtailed, and that we should have a sort of preservationist stance when it comes to, immigration and our nation as a whole. But I just say that to say that, in order to actually achieve that, you'd have to pay an extremely high price economically in order to achieve that. And it's a price that no politician is ever going to be willing to pay. Even as a society, you wouldn't be willing to pay it in some ways. If, for example, everyone became unemployed, I don't know if we would get this bad necessarily, but, let's say you had to stand in a food line and that you'd have 10 years of extreme economic pain and struggle in order to come out the other side of that, if you even do come out the other side of that. Would the political apparatus be able to bear that? And, would the country survive that sort of stress? And again, I'm not saying this to discourage that. I'm just saying that is that really the critique needs to be at the level of the economic system itself. And, the truth of our system as one being a debt-based system a fractional reserve banking system in which money is essentially not tied to anything, and money is debt, and that growth literally has to be created to keep the sort of wheel rolling, and that the corporate consolidation of wealth and of money spending and of productivity going into these sorts of monopolistic endeavors, you see that this broad system is deeply extractionary to the common man, and it also endlessly will result in increasing migration and increasing replacement of your sort of native population with people who are either cheaper on the low end or who test better on the high end, and that in any case you're getting kicked out of your village. There is no inherited right to your nation in this current system, and they're basically saying citizenship will be distributed and auctioned off to either the lowest bidder, will either bid for the lowest cost citizen, the lowest cost laborer, or will bid off citizenship to the highest performer. And you, as a participant in that system, are going to find your rank in that society changing based on how you score. I mean, it's kind of like, it's sort of like a social credit system. I mean, it literally is, I guess, but you could think about it along the lines of social credit system. If your social credit in the society, if there's not a floor on that as a sort of native-born American or native-born of any country, you are likely to get shifted around, and you will have no claim to this place, and you will become as itinerant as anyone else. And it's clear that that they can't say that, and they can't sort of talk about that openly. But if you really drill down into sort of what the values of the society are, which is sort of productivity and money, let's call it, as the primary values of society, that is the logical conclusion, of that value set, is that you as an individual are only as valuable as you are valuable to the society in material terms, and that you are liable to be replaced or moved down the ladder if someone better than you or cheaper than you comes along, and there will be no sort of system that protects you because you don't have any inherited rights as a native-born citizen of that country. And I know I've been going on for quite a while now, and not arrived at a really salient point, but the problem that the right has is that, just to circle back to one of my earlier points, is that the problem the right has is that its economic position is always just the opposite of that of the left. The left has a very codified economic position with a deep history, with lots of literature, with sophisticated intellectual and ideological underpinnings, Marxism, socialism, communism, all of these sort of redistributive points of view on critiques of capitalism are, let's call it, well-formed and tried and true. Now, they're not something that necessarily the right should get behind, because of course this sort of only increasing egalitarianism in another way, just as Curtis Yarvin and Nick Land are more of the same, more capitalism. On the communist left, it's again just more of the same, more egalitarianism, more welfare, is essentially just asking for more of the same system that's resulting in these problems as well. On the right, on the other hand, we don't have as sophisticated, or at least as a commonly understood and popularized system of critiquing capitalism from the right. Some of the traditionalist thinkers, of course, do critique capitalism from the right, but they haven't really entered the popular consciousness. The closest we really have is sort of like, Pat Buchanan and this sort of isolationist, let's bring tariffs back sort of way of looking at, the economy. And that's certainly, in a way, a good start. Like, okay, can we take individual economic ideas that are sort of anti-free market capitalism and apply them into our current system, and we can make these sort of incremental gains. Okay, we'll have our sort of monopolistic corporate corporate debt culture, but we'll add tariffs onto it, and we'll take that as an incremental victory. For example, but I don't think that that really goes far enough in order to really meaningfully change the nature of the conversation in the way it needs to be. You have, I would say, maybe some extreme libertarian corners of the conversation that can be drawn upon. Bitcoin maximalists, hard money maximalists, people who understand that in going off of the gold standard and sort of turning money into this sort of abstraction and turning money into debt, these having fundamentally, profound and disastrous effects, for the state of everything, let's just say. There's also some wisdom to be gained from there. There is a certain degree of popular understanding of these ideas. It sort of fits the conspiracy-minded approach, like when you basically tell people money's not real and that it used to be backed in gold and now it's not, and the money's only because you believe in it and it's all backed by power. These are sort of things that I think the popular consciousness in some ways is primed to accept. And also with the hype around Bitcoin and these sort of emergent technologies in crypto, et cetera, you do sort of have this potential cocktail of a sort of compelling means in which to critique the current debt-based, fiat money-based system that I think could make some major grounds as well. So I think, again, you have tariffs, you have Bitcoin maximalism, or sort of gold bug oriented ways of thinking, and sort of tapping into the idea of true value and scarcity and things like that, and sort of retooling our economy, along the lines of real money and that sort of thing. And then you have more extreme theories, let's call it maybe more like, more centrally housed by, let's call it, the actual true like traditionalist ways of looking at things, which in a sense are also redistributive, just not in a communist sense. So let's picture a redistributive system that is actually elitist in nature. So the restoring of some sort of caste-based system and some sort of inherited rights to certain things, where you could picture almost a sort of UBI applied across different classes and groups in different ways, and that people could be assigned purposes in society and certain lifestyles in society based on their station in life and their sort of innate ability. I guess in a sort of modern context, you could almost just arrange the society theoretically by some sort of IQ system or physical aptitude, and then sort of design a sort of redistributive economic model that sort of created, a sort of modernized caste system that people could live within. And then in, some other ways of thought, there's a sort of, let's call it not that extreme version, where you do have a sort of redistributive system, but it's just against monopoly and large corporation. So you essentially do your best to not allow essentially monopoly and make sure that all business stays small, and that you try as best as possible to definancialize the system and essentially give up this, let's call it the efficiency mechanisms of that sort of consolidation, and you basically keep everything small, keep everything very distributed. You don't allow for corporate consolidation, and you start to turn to the sort of mass, let's call it farm to table economy, where everything and all services is in their own way a sort of farm to table sort of model, and that everything is sort of localized. Those are just some of the options that exist on the right in terms of critiquing the capitalist system, and I know that I've done a very cursory overview of them, and just wanted to kind of show you the lay of the land. But I do think it's worth just talking about what ideas are even out there, because I think that the critique of the capitalist system right now on the side of the right is so anemic, because because to kind of tie this whole thing up, I talked about the gravity of truth sort of creating a sort of advantage on the right on these cultural issues. I think, it seems that gravity and common sense pulls people to understanding that mass migration, ethnic replacement, feminist intervention, et cetera, is not, let's call it, quote unquote, good for the common man and for the society around them. But when it comes to the economics, there's not this sort of common sense gravity that is going to pull consciousness to any sort of understanding or sophisticated critique of capitalism. At its face, the sort of conservative where gravity will pull the conservative perspective is to this sort of libertarianism. And at its face, this current the system that that you're looking at, it would be easy to fall victim into the thinking that the best thing you can do is just not touch it, or just do more of it. And that is in fact the conservative approach, because the system just works so well, you actually don't need to intervene, and that would actually be a great mistake, because the truth is that that is not the case. The system, if left unchecked, will result in a sort of Blade Runner sort of reality in which we live in a truly endlessly multicultural third world mega city in which we live like rats in a cage if left unchecked, because the consolidation will only grow more and more extreme. So common sense will dictate that you don't want to do more and more of this if you don't like the direction that things have been heading. And I think for that reason, when it comes to this economic conversation is one that's going to have to be led by a sophisticated elite of people. It's not going to be something that is affected by mass consciousness, and that elite groups of vanguard thinkers on the right wing are going to have to come together and actually put together some sort of economic program or economic perspective that is going to have to sort of be programmed into a candidate, or programmed into sort of forces within culture and society, because it's just going to be way too complicated to basically hand to the masses in order to understand. On the flip side of this, and I know I've been talking for 40 minutes now. On the flip side of this, just like the culture war issues have sort of been brought into popular consciousness, let's say through gravity or through common sense or through the state of how things are and people noticing them. Maybe this system will collapse in some way, and a similar thing will occur economically. But I think that it's not quite the same as these sort of political issues, because as I mentioned before, these systems are very sophisticated, and there's a lot of institutional power already embedded into them. And if it even were to collapse, the people that would take over the system in the state, in the aftermath of that collapse, cannot currently be trusted to, input a sort of like based, traditionalist system in place after that collapse occurs. The way the system is designed right now, it leaves it ripe for the taking for an even probably worse class of speculators and people who are going to manipulate the system, to their own gain. So I don't think that necessarily waiting for the system to collapse or show cracks and letting it do so is going to be good enough to ensure that, let's call it, a popular critique of the system as a whole is gonna actually carry through and take this thing into the next level. So it's a big head scratcher topic. It's on my mind constantly. I would love to hear what any of you think about this. If any of you were patient enough to sit through this. Hope you're all doing well. Peace.